The new movie Dunkirk's drawn a lot of attention, probably because Chris Nolan directed it. Don't know how many people, or Americans anyway, care about the Battle of Dunkirk. It's not really a battle. If it was fought mainly by the French so that the British could escape. Contrary to the movie, French were actually given orders not to leave. And so I've seen some things about Dunkirk as a war movie, and one is it the best war movie, or comparing it to Saving Private Ryan. And I have some of my war movies here, or in the case of the Pacific or Band of Brothers, of course, miniseries. And technically, there's one here that's actually the Korean War. It's Pork Chop Hill, starring Gregory Peck. It's an excellent movie in black and white, and directed by Lou Ayres, who starred in All Quiet on the Western Front, if I'm remembering correctly. Now, there's a great movie, a silent movie. Of course, it's based on an excellent book. Now, none of these are World War One movies. I mean, making a good World War One movie, that's tough, because if you show anything about what really happened, as bad as World War II was in places, that really sucked. So you've got a movie like Paths of Glory by Kubrick, starring Kirk Douglas. There's just the one battle, and then after the French soldiers realized the futility again of the attack and retreat, the French army has a court-martial in the manner of Roman legions, who would do, if a unit retreated, at what was called a decimation, or where decimation comes from the Roman, where they take 1 in 10, decem, like the 10th month, 10th, 10, every 10th man. And so men are picked at random and they're put on trial. Well, in Dunkirk, we see the men on trial, and they are young. And Nolan gets that part right. He has the young pop star, forget the kid's name. You can make noise about that, but what that really does, it shows, and he looks at how young these soldiers are. Now, actually, the British soldiers who were over there in France were probably a little older because they were the regular army. But for the most part, until later in the war, in the case of the Germans and the Russians, I suppose, most of the fighting and dying was young by young kids like that pop singer. And that's a great thing. So if you compare it, as I've seen done to Saving Private Ryan, in that cast, those guys are a lot older. I mean, Sizemore and Hanks, and even Damon must be 30. They're way too old, by 10 years at least, for enlisted men, and 5 or 6 or 10, depending, for the officers. They were young, and I think it'd be frightening to see. If you have a teenager around you when I'm talking about this, or you have children who are 18, 19, 20, in their early 20s, those are the people. And frankly, a lot of war movies, going back to the propaganda films of the 40s, where they had to use the actors who were available, and they were all older guys. So a movie that's not, I can't even find, Bataan with Robert Taylor, those men were older. And although it is one of my favorite movies. So the one thing about Dunkirk, well, it gets that right. I love the time dilation with the 3 different sets of time, the hour, the day, and the week. One thing it doesn't do that a lot of these movies do is it doesn't show scope. And I was checking, Nolan did that silly Batman movie with Bane in New York City, and that whole special effects apocalypse, and a war between the New York Police Department, if I remember correctly, and Bane's army, or pseudo-army. That had more scope, admittedly, with special effects. And I get it. He wants to do the retro look like Spielberg without the jumpy camera, so he's got to use as much real stuff and stay away from the CGI. But I mean, if you look at Flags of Our Fathers, which is here, they use CGI to great effect for the ships, show the scale. Of course, that's the American war machine late in, God, I think it's February of 1945. So, in a way, the impersonality of CGI kind of works for the United States Navy there, and probably for ships in general. But I was disappointed. We had a couple of Stukas. The sirens were done very well. This freaked me out. They attacked 30, 40, 50, 60 planes at a time. not a couple. The RAF was over there the whole time. They lost hundreds of planes, and the Royal Navy was out in force. Actually, Royal Navy destroyers carried away most of the survivors, not the small boats, which were important, I think, psychologically too. Um, and I thought the older British man, I forget his name, who has the boat and goes over there on his own. I mean, let's face it, that was moving because he shows he understands. And I think Nolan does a beautiful job with this. He understands that it's the young men that are going to do it. And that's not really right. And if there's an opportunity, and I have read that because of the stress, like the American Army in Normandy in 1944, after Omaha Beach, stress was so great. One man comment, old men couldn't hack it. And it was men. Maybe for the Soviet Army, I think there were women. It was mainly men. The nervous system couldn't take it. So Nolan does a beautiful job there, and he also would, I think, like Spielberg in Saving Private Ryan, he does show us the larger fort when a couple of Royal Navy officers come down the dock with clipboards to mobilize the private boats. Spielberg has something like that in Saving Private Ryan that never gets talked about, which I thought was tremendous. The scene after the beach scene, all the women in the steno pool typing death notices. And we see all of the number of women there, I don't know, 40, 50, 60, all typing, the clatter of the old typewriters, the stacks of the notices. It's a brilliant way to show the magnitude of that. I looked up, Nolan's born in 1970, and Spielberg's born in 46. Spielberg's a baby boomer. He grew up with veterans. Nolan's whatever, Gen X. He's after that. And, I have read that the movie people, they were affected by that. Like Lucas and all the Star Wars movies, he's totally affected. He has his, stormtroopers and Darth Vader in a Japanese samurai outfit. I mean, let's face it, what's the lightsaber anyway? So, Nolan is a different guy, and I think it's a little weird that given the special effects in some of his other movies where you have the opportunity to show something that's really big and 300,000 men, the entire British army at the time. I mean, if they don't get those guys off, the British would lose another 250,000 men captured. They couldn't afford to lose 300,000 more. They had the Royal Navy and they had an Air Force, and they were about to begin the Battle of Britain, and after that, the Battle of the Atlantic. So you get some sense of the stakes, but by personalizing it here, that doesn't really work for me. Focusing on the small group, I get it. He does a great job of showing how shitty a situation it is to be a soldier, and that you probably in the end of the day, all you maybe do care about is yourself, unless someone sets the example through leadership, like the old man and the pilot. Really, the Tom Hardy character at the end. What a beautiful final shot. Maybe it's hokey or not, but it's great. And the music by is brilliant as well. He does a lot of great things. But maybe not really the German bombardment, the German air attacks, the efforts of the Royal Navy to get those men off, those boys, so Britain could go on fighting. I don't know. I feel like that's missing. Although I like many other things that he did. Does it really show what was at stake? I don't know. I know a lot about history. People who don't, did you get that feeling? Other than the emotional attachment we might have to the young soldiers, did you get the feeling that if Britain didn't get these soldiers off and the Germans were doing everything they could to stop them, it could be disaster, not just for the British, but for the Americans? After all, the war was really just Britain at this point against Italy and Germany. The Soviets had cut their deal with Hitler the previous August in 1939, and we were not going to do anything until France fell when we passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act to protect ourselves. But it'd be another, almost 18 months, another year and a half before we got in, and that was because the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And the Soviets got in because Hitler double-crossed them And a year from when this story takes place, he would launch Operation Barbarossa. So the Japanese would bring in, and the Germans between them would bring in the two greatest powers. The Japanese were already fighting China, as they had been throughout the 1930s. So in the interim, it really was just the British and the Australians and the New Zealanders and the South Africans and the Poles who escaped Poland and the Free French and some Belgians and some Norwegians, some Netherlanders, but not much else. They were it. And these soldiers were the only experienced large body of men who still existed. They had to get off that beach. Did the movie convey that? I'd like to know.